Brian, thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's great to be here today. Really appreciate CTA TechCo inviting me to this event. I understand that I probably stand between you guys and lunch, so I'll try to keep this at a pretty good clip. I think it's a really cool merger between the two entities. You've got innovation, celebration. That's a pretty sweet combination. As Brian talked about, what I'd like to sort of go through and have a conversation about is the sharing economy, and in particular the role that millennials play with them. But I can't help myself, since I am indeed a recovering political consultant. I may try to relate it a little bit to the presidential campaign, if you'll allow me that leave. But look, everyone in this room are innovators. You spend a lot of your time, as we do, thinking not just about where the world is today, but where the world is going to be going. The last panel was just fantastic on that. At Airbnb, we certainly think about what those big mega trends out there that are really sort of driving the sharing economy. I think some of these will probably be pretty familiar to you, since you do spend time thinking about this, but let me tick through them quickly here. Our world is changing. That really is beginning with the nature of our people are changing. The millennial generation is going to represent the largest generation in history. And if you think about where they'll be by 2025, particularly when you connect them with Generation Z, this will be more than half of all workers, just about half of voters. And this is a generation with just different perspectives on the world, particularly compared to the boomer generation. This is a generation that really focuses on experience. They're more willing to spend money on experience than necessarily on a material good or material benefit. And you think about what's happening in America cities and really global cities, which is for the first time since the 1930s in America, you have as many people moving into cities as are moving into the suburbs. That's the first in 80, 90 years. And that really is a function of how these millennials are living and reflects the fact that they're looking for experience-based lives. The second massive change taking place is technology. Again, something that everyone in this room is obviously very, very familiar with. But think about it, there's more power in your device in your hand, than infinitely more power than was in the Apollo 11 rocket that took humankind to the moon for the first time. A generation ago, for boomers, the car was a liberating tool for them. It allowed them to move around in ways that they hadn't. For the millennial generation, it's these devices. They live, they work, they play, they connect over these people-to-people platforms. And it's just fundamentally changing how they engage with society. Not surprisingly, they love their technology. Well over 90% believe that technology gives them more opportunity. Over 80% talk about how it connects them with their friends and families. And so this technology is inherent into how they live their lives. Trend number 3 that we see out there is climate. The climate is changing. 15 of the last 16 years, hottest on record. Last year was the hottest recorded. This year will surpass last year. Each corresponding month this year has been hotter than the corresponding month last year. As a result of that, we're living in a time period where sustainability, particularly for millennials, is a huge issue. These are people, shared bikes, shared gardens, energy distribution, shared cars, shared housing. And look at where the millennials are on this issue. Basically a 20-point gap between how they view the issue of climate and how the baby boomers view the issue of climate. And what that means is that for this generation, sustainability is core to their existence. And so they look at things out there where there's underutilized assets that are not being used in a sustainable way. They recognize that 95% of the time a car is not being used. You look at housing, which is obviously the space that we're in. Over 13 million units of housing that are empty. Over 33 million bedrooms that are empty. Again, for a generation that has come up in a time period where sustainability is core to their existence, this is really relevant to them. And then the fourth massive change that's taking place out there is what's going on with the economy. Obviously, we have evolved from an industrial age into an information age economy. But the nature of work has begun to change as a result of that. Consider the number of people who have telecommuted at one point in time. It's a significant number in this country. If you look at the number of of folks who are now freelancers. A very, 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 very large number of Americans have been freelancers at one point in time, and that's particularly the case with millennials, and it is leading to a significant part of the economy. Again, a changing workforce and a changing nature of work. Suddenly, a lot of this was really impacted by the economic issue in 2008, the Great Recession. It had a real impact on how our economy is working, obviously. We commissioned a study by Gene Sperling, former economic advisor to President Clinton, President Obama, potentially future economic advisor to a future President Clinton. And he took a look at earnings and was able to document that since 2008 for the middle class, there has basically been a $7,000, a little bit more delta in terms of what they would have been projected to earn from what they're currently earning. Some slightly good news over the last couple of months, there has been a little bit of an uptick there, but nonetheless, you have a generation of folks who, over the last 8 years, are really in a fundamentally different place economically than they expected to be. For millennials, this has really impacted them from a debt perspective. When I was back in college in the early 90s, debt was at a fundamentally different level in terms of student education debt. It's now a 10x for today's millennials in terms of the debt that they're leaving college with, and that just has a huge impact on how they view the world. Related to the debt situation is also the fact that we're going through a transition in terms of the role of robotics and AI. Again, some of the stuff that I think you've probably talked about over the last few days. But that's having a real specific impact on a class of jobs called redundant jobs, jobs where there's routine skills that take place. Those are the jobs that are ultimately going to be really impacted, potentially displaced by the advances in AI and robotics. I think everyone has a responsibility to think about what this is going to mean for folks in the future of work. But it certainly is a significant thing. And if you consider the millennials, they're now in a time period where they have huge debt coming out of college. They're looking at employment opportunities that are just very different. There are studies out there that have suggested that almost as much as 50% of jobs out there could be replaced by robotics or AI. So a huge overhang for them. You put all of these elements together. You put the fact that the people are changing, that technology is changing, the environment is changing, the economy is changing. Those are all the magic sauce that went into the birth of the sharing economy, with the catalytic moment being the 2008 economic recession. And when you think about the sharing economy, it's important to recognize that there are sort of two different sectors. There is what I would call the labor sector, and that is folks who are literally sharing their labor, and the drive-sharing companies are an example of that. And then there's shared assets, and that's what Airbnb is, and that is taking an asset that's been underutilized, underused, and finding a way to generate economics from that. And so our company came about in 2008. I'll tell a little bit of the story about it. You had two millennials sharing an apartment in San Francisco. The company was ultimately founded by three millennials, but they were having a difficult time making their rent. And so they decided to put up a couple air mattresses when a conference was taking place in San Francisco to raise a little bit of money. They were able to do that. They made their rent. Light bulb went over their head that, hey, maybe this is a business idea. They then went to 50, 60, 70, I forget the exact number, but a huge number of VCs to see if they could get some seed startup money. And predictably at the time, people thought it was a crazy idea. Who's going to open up their houses? How can you scale a business like this? And so ultimately what they did is they actually took some cereal boxes, redesigned them. This was in the middle of the 2008 presidential campaign. One box was called Obama O's, another box was called Captain McCain's. They sold those boxes. They maxed out on all their credit cards. They used that money to launch the company at the 2008 Democratic Convention in Denver, and boom, the company was off to the races. And it went from making sofas available, to making houses available, to making tree houses available, to making igloos available. And we even last week saw someone, this is sort of a true sign of the times, who took a taxi cab in New York and had converted it into a house and put it up on Airbnb. So if you want to spend a night in New York in a yellow cab, you're happy to, you're welcome to. And a growth from there has been really pretty significant. We're now in 35,000 cities. We're in 191 countries. It's often easier to identify the countries we're not in, places like Iran, Syria, North Korea. We're always looking for a volunteer for our first North Korean traveler, so let me know. And we passed, over the course of the summer, passed the 100 million mark in terms of number of folks who have traveled on Airbnb. And at the same time, our hosts, the people who open up their homes, continue to grow, over 2 million hosts. And one of the more interesting dynamics really over the last couple of years has been amongst our fastest growing cohort of hosts are actually senior women. They sort of track back to some of that earlier data. They have empty rooms in their home. Many of them are in fixed incomes. Some are trying to avoid reverse mortgages. And this has served both as an economic lifeline to them, but also as a social lifeline for them in their lives. Now, as we go forward, right, we obviously have a series of touchstones, and I'll just go through them. There's about 4 of them that we think about in terms of how we think about our continued economic success. The first one is just where the sharing economy is. Right now, it's at $15 billion. It's projected over the next 10 years to get to $335 billion. Right? So that's the first thing. We're in a space that looks like it's going to continue to grow and grow at a pretty significant pace. The second issue that we look at is just for us in particular, travel has been changing. My grandparents came to this country from different parts of the world via a ship like this, although this one's probably a little fancier than the one they were on. Today, their great-grandchildren, my kids, get to travel all over the world on planes. And then if you look at what air travel has done really since 1950 until today, you can see the continued acceleration of it. Over 3 billion people traveling by air, and air tends to be a pretty good proxy in terms of what's going on in the travel and tourism space. Look at the number of just pure tourists and how that trend line has gone since 1950. A really significant acceleration there. And what's interesting about both those trend lines, they basically match and align with one another. But what they really reflect is that through good times and bad, wars, recessions, what have you, there has continued to be more and more people traveling. And so that, in particular, what you're seeing with traveling is that millennials are big travelers. Almost 10%, let me actually come back to a quick factoid I had forgotten, which is if you look at where tourism is now today in terms of its economic impact globally, almost 10% of the GDP. That actually is almost twice as much as oil revenue that you saw in the last year. Just, again, giving you a sense of how big this space is and the fact that it's continuing to grow and some of the trend lines on it. Now, millennials tend to be a pretty significant subset of those travelers. They over-index in traveling. They like to travel internationally. The 200 million millennials account for almost $200 billion in travel. And based on survey data, the millennials say they want to travel more. That's where they want to spend their money. They'd rather spend their money on travel than on material goods. Again, tracking back to some of the earlier data about some of the cultural attitudes of millennials. The third category I would point to is we track to see how many people are actually engaged in the sharing economy and whether they like it. To date in America, about 72% of folks have used some version of the sharing economy or on-demand tools. But what's really interesting about it for us is the favorability and likability and how much they're enjoying that. Well over 80% say that it makes their lives easy. They say it makes their lives more affordable. They talk about the fact that it really allows them to connect in their community and with their friends and families in a different way. And finally, they like it because it is a tool that allows them to live a more sustainable lifestyle. And we've looked at the number of folks, particularly millennials, who have done home sharing, and the numbers are pretty significant particularly when you start to project out where this will go over the next 10 years. Over 70% of those between 25 and 34 have used home sharing, and about 67% between those 18 and 24. And so, again, you can see the trend lines in terms of where this is going. The fourth touchstone that we follow in terms of our continued growth and blessings and success is, are we delivering on a value proposition to society? Are we strengthening communities? And we believe we do so in 3 ways, but we track this really closely. The first is, democratizing travel. I think many of you may remember something that was called the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour was something that aristocrats had available to them in the 1800s and 1900s, where really the top 1%, top 1/10 of 1% would be able to travel through Europe and go to museums and stay at villas and have fine food. But it was really limited to a very, 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 very discrete segment of society. Now tourism, because of platforms like ours, is being opened up in a completely different way. I'll give you a little statistic from New York City, one of our top markets. We saw our fastest growth in New York City, over 70%, in those 50 zip codes in New York City that are, by census tract data, majority minority zip codes. These are places that historically have not benefited from tourism. Over $40 million generated in the last year in those zip codes. And there's a reason for this, or at least a partial explanation for it, and that is the nature of millennials in terms of their background. This is an exceptionally diverse cohort of people. 44% are folks of color, and so not surprisingly, they're looking to travel to different places and have different types of experiences. The second really critical value proposition that we need to deliver on is democratizing revenue. Many American cities, global cities, are facing significant fiscal constraints. We can help generate real revenue for them. We generate revenue in terms of bringing tourism to places that have historically not benefited, as we saw on the prior slide. But we also can generate real tax dollars. I'll tell you a quick little story. I was at the US Conference of Mayors, a large organization, represents most of America's big cities. And I stood there at an event in Washington, D.C. in January, and I got up there and I said, I'm going to do something that probably no private sector entity has ever done. Read my lips, we want to pay taxes. And it was sort of like silence in the room, and I had to say it again to really make the point. But it is something that we can do, and for cities that are facing real fiscal limitations, it is a significant revenue for them. We have done a little bit of an analysis. Over the last year, we've generated about $80 million. We know if we're paying taxes in the top 50 cities in America, that's about $200 million a year, $2 billion over 10 years. And cities are starting to use this money in really creative ways. I was particularly proud of the fact that we did a partnership with the city of Chicago earlier this year where we generated revenue for them that they are going to use to actually help pay for their homelessness challenge. And to us, that's a real interesting and smart way to use that revenue, a program that had not had sufficient funding that we're able to make available. Over the last year or so, we've done over 200 such partnerships globally, and almost on a daily basis, we are doing another partnership somewhere in the world to help generate revenue. And the third value proposition that we really have to deliver on is democratizing capitalism. So most of the Airbnb hosts, a typical Airbnb host is a middle-class person. They're making their home available about 47 times a year. That they take 97% of the money. So our economic model really channels the money down to the person, to the ground level. And as a result of that, they're making, the typical host is making about $7,500 a year. And you remember earlier we had gone through a little slide on how much money the middle class had lost, the Gene Sperling study that I had referenced. And if you take a look at the amount of money that we're generating for those hosts who have lost this, we're helping to make up that gap. And so that's incredibly important that we deliver on that, and that's really the sort of core fundamental value proposition that we deliver. Now, earlier I had mentioned trying to bring in the presidential campaign on this. A lot of us are thinking about the value proposition in the context of the candidates. And as part of following the campaign, what has become very clear is that millennials are going to play an incredibly important role here, potentially a dispositive role in terms of who is the next president of the United States. The share of their vote, it's interesting. They right now have the same amount of potential voters or eligible voters as the baby boomers. In terms of actual voters or what they're projected to vote at, it's a little bit lower, but still a pretty significant, healthy amount. 27% of the electorate will be millennials. Now, millennials are going to be incredibly impactful in the swing states. We've actually gone and looked at where they are in the swing states. There's a significant number of swing states up in this election, and we've done some polling and research into it. But by way of context, in 2012, you could make the argument that Barack Obama was reelected president because of the millennial vote. In the 4 key swing states in that election, he carried 61% of the millennial vote. If Mitt Romney had actually split the vote and carried 50% of the millennial vote, he would now be President Romney. And so in this election, the millennials are potentially going to be the key swing vote. And there's a way to sort of look at it. There's been a number of polls that have come out in September showing where the horse race is. And when a head-to-head matchup between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, Hillary has a pretty sizable advantage with millennial voters, which is giving her about a 4 or 5, which is helping to give her about a 4 or 5 point lead overall in the horse race. But when you do a four-way race, those millennial voters begin to migrate to other places. I think somewhat, again, reflective of their principles, their ethos, their values. And that lead then obviously dissipates pretty significantly. Now, we have to see how this plays out once you get to October and how are voters thinking about this. But in the first part of September, we have seen those horse race numbers get a lot closer in the four-way race because millennial voters are shifting in terms of who they're supporting. Now, so we dug into this a little bit and wanted to see, what is it that attracts millennial voters to a particular presidential candidate? Innovators in this room should be happy to hear this, which is that well over 80% of those millennials said that one of the key attractions to them for a candidate would be someone who embraces innovation, who's thinking about the future, who's forward-looking. We then went even below that and took a look at what their impression was of the sharing economy. Sharing economy in many ways is a signifier to this generation of innovation. Generally voters across the board like the sharing economy. Millennials in particular over-indexed on it, and that was also the case in these swing states. And so we would posit that one way for a candidate to really be able to appeal to these voters, talk about innovation, talk about the sharing economy. We at Airbnb, and this is self-serving, but we wanted to see what those voters thought about us in the context of the campaign. Overall, really strong favorabilities, positives from voters. Again, not surprising, millennials had an incredibly strong view of us, and those views carried over to those millennials in the swing state. But we did focus groups and research to try to understand why those millennials liked us so much in the context of the presidential campaign and politics. And it's really interesting how it lined up with that value proposition that I had talked about earlier. They liked us because of what we're doing for the middle class. They like us because we're helping democratize tourism. They like us because it's helping people connect with their community. And so, we're 40, I'm doing the math in my head, 47, 46 days away from the election. I think the events of this week have really reflected the challenges that we as a society, that we in America face. But all of you, and I began this conversation with this point, are also looking ahead to where the world is going. As an optimist, I look at this data out there. I look at the trend lines. I look at some of this polling data. I look at some of the data that we see in terms of the growth. And I'm incredibly optimistic about where the world is going to go. When these millennials by 2025 really become the dominant force in society, right, they'll be more than half of workers, about half of all voters. I fundamentally think we're going to see some real significant shifts in terms of how our society works. On the political side, we've gone through 20+ years of paralysis. That paralysis has reflected real divisions in the country. But you're going to have a generation here that's going to be the dominant generation that does share similar values, that does share similar principles, that does share a similar ethos about life. And it may be different, but there's a commonality there, and that really offers a promise of actually an era of consensus, of collaboration, and breaking through that paralysis that I think has really been a challenge for our country. I think in terms of how people work, we talked about some of the challenges that this generation is facing with debt, with robotics and AI. The flip of it is that there's going to be an explosion of potentially new jobs in the creative class and people-to-people activity. And those are jobs that people typically actually have much more positive experiences with and enjoy their work much more. And then the third, I think, big change that will take place will be really how people live. There's always been the Marshall McLuhan talking about the global village. I think we're going to end up with global villages. These are going to be places that are very sustainable and walkable, places that are incredibly diverse and inclusive, places where people really like to be with each other, spend time with each other. And so I think you project out 10 years from now, and we're going to be in a world where I fundamentally believe that anyone will be able to belong anywhere. And we at Airbnb are really excited about that future. We're really honored and love being in the middle of it and part of it. but do think that at the end of the day, this will be a great place for our country and really the world to end up. So why don't I stop there? Thank you very much for having me. If folks have any questions, I think I have some time.
Oh, no.
Uh-oh, that was quite a...
Thank you. That was an amazingly wonderful, uplifting presentation, except about these young people taking over the world. As an Airbnb user in many states, I love it. It's just fabulous. As recently as just 3 weeks ago, I spent 5 days in LA, and it was a great alternative. Since you raised the presidential election,
Yes.
you know, in looking at the last year, the only candidate that was really aggressively embracing the shared economy was one that did not make it to the finish line, is Marco Rubio. He has a whole paragraph in his, a whole chapter in his book on the shared economy. Very, very positive. Donald Trump hasn't said anything that I'm aware of, but we all know he owns hotels and might have a certain perspective. Hillary Clinton seemed to be about saying something negative, and there were even some headlines, but her staff kind of, it seemed, pulled her back. What do you want to hear Monday night? I mean, this presentation, it sounds like you want them to see it, and you're trying to encourage Hillary Clinton to say something really positive to get those millennials excited. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, a couple points. First of all, I appreciate the question. It's funny, I travel around the world and do a lot of events, and it is amazing the interest level in what's going on here around the world. I've gotten to a point where I begin these conversations by just saying, okay, let's begin with the Donald Trump questions, then we can go to the other questions, just to sort of get them out of the way. But yeah, I do think that you know, this is a campaign where I don't think either candidate has necessarily really spoken in a way that connects with millennials and sort of shows that they quote unquote get it. I think, and obviously I'm biased, I'm a Hillary supporter. I worked obviously in the Clinton White House, and I'm a big fan of hers. I think she has touched on issues relating to student debt in a really interesting way, but there's sort of a cultural connection that I don't think, you know, either of the candidates have gotten. I do think that Senator Rubio, you know, took an Uber or Lyft, I forget one of the ones during the campaign, and I think even some of his folks stayed in Airbnbs. By the way, most of the campaign a lot of campaign staff and volunteers stay in these places and use these, you know, these tools. But I don't think either campaign has really done a particularly effective job at ultimately connecting with these voters. And you can really see that when you sort of go from the two-way race into that multiple-way race, because you can see how people move pretty quickly. And there's a whole school of thought, and I can go on and on this, but I'll try to be relatively brief, about, you know, what this generation is going to represent from a political ideological perspective. There is this whole idea that they're going to be, the phrase is libertarian. And what that means is, in effect, and this is just a very summary and not doing complete justice to it, but a generation that on social issues is very progressive, but on economic issues is not necessarily looking for big government programs or sort of the old way of doing things, but looking to be empowered so that they can control their lives. And I don't think either candidate has really gone out there, you know, and articulated that. I think, you know, whether it happens or not on Monday, and I certainly hope it does, you know, I know that Hillary has spent time with folks out here who really are involved with this, including us. You know, our founders did a recent fundraiser with her. And I think she's very open and interested in this. I certainly am not speaking for the campaign. But I do think that ultimately, because these folks are going to be such a big chunk of the electorate, that those people running for office over the next 10 years are not going to have any choice if they want to be successful in actually being able to connect and talk about these issues in a way that resonate, because these voters are going to determine whether you're elected or not.
Okay, non-millennial. So two quick questions. One is, and I think it's instructive for this audience, when in the process did Airbnb decide we have to be interested in policy? Was it from the outset? Was it somewhere along the way? And the second question is more to your point about community. Yeah. Have you looked at the impact of Airbnb, and I live in New York City, as you can tell from my voice. On the Lower East Side, it looks like the whole world is moving in a suitcase on the weekend. It impacts people. People are unhappy. Co-ops are talking about not letting owners use their places, their Airbnb. So address those two things.
Yeah, I'll take them into two different issues. On the first one, in terms of policy engagement, as you could see from the timeline, this company went from an idea, literally running out of an apartment in San Francisco, to 8 years later at being, over 100 million folks. And so it just ramped up, and that's a high-class challenge, right? A high-class problem for anyone to have. I think, probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago, when you started to get to such a scale and size, it became apparent that, there needed to really be a proactive approach to policy. I think, it's a company that is very, very mission-driven, very, very values-based, and from the beginning, always a perception that home sharing is a way to help strengthen communities because of the value proposition, I talked about. But I think a recognition and realization as they began to grow that we're in a period where the metaphor here is transitioning from a horse and buggy to a car, and that you do need rules for things, but you need new rules to apply to a new thing. Home sharing itself is not necessarily new. It's been around for a long time. Over a digital platform at scale is a new thing, and I think the company has recognized and really embraced the idea that we need to work with cities to try to figure it out. In fact, last November, we put out something called the Airbnb Policy Compact, which was a framework about how we like to work with cities. It had three basic components: pay taxes, pay our fair share of taxes, which is typically hotel taxes. I talked about that. Secondly, share data and information so cities can really see what the impact is. And then third, work with cities to find solutions. Every city is very different and has unique challenges, and we have to work with those cities consistent with their particular needs. In terms of New York, we actually implemented this to a degree in New York, which is, I think, last November, shortly after we did the compact. We took a step back and looked at where we were in New York. And the issue in New York, and it's a valid and real issue, has been the issue of housing accessibility and availability. And so we took a look at the platform and made a decision to do something what is called a one host, one listing approach. And what that really means is a proxy for people only being able to do it on our platform if they're actually doing it from the home that they live in. The idea there being that we didn't want to be taking long-term housing off the market. And since we announced that, we took down, and this is the numbers are in my head, I may be slightly off, but I think over 2,000 homes, the listings were taken off because we thought that they were potentially impacting the long-term rental market. Home sharing is taking place. It's, there's the old Victor Hugo line, which is, it's an idea so big that it's going to be difficult to stop. I think that's fundamentally true for all the reasons I talked about it. But I also think it's incredibly important that we work with places like New York to make sure it's working consistent with what they may need in their particular places.
Chris, Jeff Joseph with CTA over on this side. Hey, obviously recently in the news, Airbnb diversity report. What if you could address that? Sort of one, what the response has been, and two, I think in the context of quote unquote new economy, sharing economy companies, how that fits into sort of Airbnb's your view of the role of the corporate social responsibility role of these companies. Yeah, it's
a great question, and I'm not sure. I'll give a little context in case folks don't understand the whole background. So in the spring, there was a series of reports of whether some guests were being impacted because of their racial background in terms of hosts welcoming them in. That was primarily African Americans in the U.S. And so the issue was, if you were black, were you having a harder time trying to get a listing? And we certainly took a look at the data, and there were public reports, and recognized that there clearly is an issue there. Now, at some level, we're a mirror into larger issues in society, but for us, first of all, we have values that begin with our founders that at their base are about inclusion. Secondly, as a company whose focus is on bringing people together, it was just fundamental to our business model to actually engage on this and really lean into it. And so what we did is we brought on two folks to really help us. A woman by the name of Laura Murphy, who had been at the ACLU for many years and really on the forefront of various civil rights issues, particularly involving accommodation issues. And we brought in former Attorney General Eric Holder, and we put together a 90-day review process and spent time with many of the leading civil rights groups and other people who've really been out front on these types of issues. About 2 weeks ago, we put out a report that had a series of pretty specific reforms that we're putting in place to really seek to address the issue. At a minimum, making sure that the platform is not facilitating conscious or unconscious bias that may exist out there. But even beyond that, and this is aspirational, but it is built into the plan, trying to see if we can actually use the platform in a positive way to potentially be able to overcome some unconscious bias that exists out there, including both specific trainings for our hosts and travelers, but also things like using the reviews in a way to potentially be able to trump some preconceived notions. I mean, and we're very early in this process. I don't want to overstate it, but one of the things that we have seen is that if you have a series of positive reviews, that will become really the most dispositive thing in terms of whether someone's going to agree to host you or not. And there are things that we could potentially do to help on that, and then be able to use that review system, which really is a people-to-people network version of the social contract, in a really positive way. I will say, we were very honored that many of the leading civil rights organizations pointed to the report as an example of how tech companies and peer-to-peer platforms should actually engage and conduct themselves on this. I think we internally know that it's really just the end of the beginning, that there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and it's constant work. We now have, I think we're the first tech company to ever do this. We have an entire team of designers and engineers and product folks who have now been assembled just to focus on this issue as we go forward. Again, that relates back to the fact that it really is core to our mission and our business model. I do think, more broadly speaking, that as there's more and more sharing economy companies, as technology companies play a bigger and bigger role, I do think it's, and I'm only speaking for us, but trying to answer the question, I do think it's going to be increasingly incumbent for those folks to think about how they act in the context of some of these larger societal challenges, because I do think that all of us, and certainly we believe this, have a role to play, both to make sure that stuff is not taking place, but also to see if we can use our technology and use some of these platforms to actually begin to address some issues that have been plaguing our society for a very long time. Great, okay.
Are we done with questions, or I can ask one question?
Go ahead. I haven't gotten the hook yet.
Okay, so I heard your presentation, it was fantastic, and then I missed some of the questions, and I don't know if somebody maybe already asked this. But can you talk a little bit more about any other trends that you noticed among millennials in terms of sustainability, if there are any?
Yeah, this is a space that I have been very active in, even before I came to Airbnb. Obviously, I showed some of the data about the delta between baby boomers and millennials on climate, but it really does go to the center of how their lives are organized. You see this in a variety of consumer choices they make, how they think about companies. There's cultural signifiers that impact, but it really goes to something I sort of touched on briefly in the presentation, which is they have grown up, most of these people, in a time period where the climate has just fundamentally changed, and they get in a different way that this is their challenge, and a challenge and problem that was created by others but left to them, and is going to impact them as they become adults and move through the course of their life and their children. And for them, when you sort of ask like top 3 issues that are facing the country, it is a top 3 issue. You don't necessarily get that with other demographic groups from a generational cohort perspective, but for them it certainly is. And so if you sort of expand out and assume that they're going to be where they are, which is more than half of workers and half of consumers and half of voters, you can assume that this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue for them, and a bigger and bigger issue in terms of how we engage politically. I've always thought our biggest challenge on this issue, and again, I had spent a lot of time in the climate movement, is I have no doubt that the politics on this is going to change, and going to change pretty quickly because of some of those fundamental issues I just touched on, and the fact that we're going to be impacted more and more economically by some of the impact of climate. I think the biggest concern has always been our political system tends to lag a little bit in terms of where the actual public is, and we have a very small window in which to be able to get ahead and deal with the climate issue. And do those politics kick in quickly enough that it then leads to the political system making some of the changes it needs to make?
All right.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
That was
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you so much.